Alright guys, in this video we're going to look at fonts, specifically the font family property and font size property. So you might want to use different styles of fonts in different websites and different user interfaces. So we're going to take a look at how to do that. We're going to talk about web-safe fonts and also how to use fonts from other sources like Google Fonts. So let's create a new file here called 03_fonts.html. And we're going to put our boilerplate in here, and let's go down and just change the title to fonts, and let's put our style tags in here for our CSS. And then I'm going to copy from the last file the selectors, just the two divs that are in the HTML here, just so we can use them as a text display. So I'm going to save this and then open with Live Server. And let's make it a little bigger. I'll hold Control and hit the plus symbol and just make these a little bigger. All right. So in our style right here, let's add a selector for the body. That's usually where you're going to add your font family, because then it affects your whole page, right? So the fonts for your whole page. So we want to use font-family, which takes in a font stack. So basically a list of different fonts, and in VS Code we get this cool drop down of font stacks that we can choose from. But before we get into that, I want to take a look at web-safe fonts. Now you have the ability to use pretty much any font that you want that you can get your hands on, but if they're not these web-safe fonts, then you're going to want to include the actual font files within your website, just like you would include a CSS file. And you can also link to them remotely, which I'm going to show you how to do with Google Fonts. But these right here, you don't need to do anything extra for, because they're gonna be available in all browsers that users are using to view your website with. And notice that there's multiple fonts. These are actually called font stacks. For instance, this first one, Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. What's going to happen is it's going to look for the Arial font to use. If it can't find that, it'll move to use Helvetica. If it can't find that, it'll use any sans serif font. So basically you have sans serif and serif, and this is an example of what these look like. So basically a serif font has these edges, these points on the edge, and a sans serif font is like a flat look. For the most part, you're probably going to want to use a sans serif font because they just look neater. They also look much more modern, and part of the reason for that is because Times New Roman, which is a very serif font, is the default. Okay, so when we don't add a font family, that's what's used. Some of my favorite web-safe fonts are Arial. I also like Verdana. I like Tahoma. So let's jump back into VS Code and Chrome. And by default, like I said, it's using sans serif. You can see the kind of like the point. See the A right here. So I want to change this to Arial. Now in VS Code, if I just type in A, Arial Helvetica Sans Serif is actually an option. Okay, so this is a font stack. Like I said, it's going to look for Arial, then Helvetica Sans Serif. If I save this, notice how it changes into a flatter looking font. Okay, let's try something else. Let's try Verdana. So if I just put a V in there, Verdana is gonna pop up. So we have Verdana, Geneva, Tahoma, Sans Serif. Save it. It's a little different, but it's still a sans serif font. Okay, so if you want to use something different, something that isn't in that list I showed you, then what I would recommend is using Google Fonts. So I'm going to open up a new browser here and just make it bigger, and let's head over to fonts.google.com. so here you can go over to the search. You can search for certain fonts, you can browse them if you want, you can see samples of them. I like Roboto, that's one I use quite a bit, and you'll see it pops up over here. There's Roboto Condensed, Roboto Mono, Slab. So let's say we want to use this Roboto font. We can click this plus sign right here, and we get this little pop-up. And if I click on that, it shows us how we can bring this into our HTML. We can do it using a link tag, just like we do with just regular CSS files. We can also import it into our CSS like this. Usually I do import it, but since we're putting our CSS in the HTML file, I'm just going to use the link. Okay, so if we grab that, and then it shows us how we can actually implement it, we can just add the font family and then Roboto sans serif. So let's go back into VS Code, and let's open up our other browser here. And let's go right below the, actually we'll go right above the title and paste in that link. Okay, so it links to fonts, googleapis.com/CSS, and then as a parameter it has family equals Roboto. So now we should be able to go ahead and put in Roboto just like it said, and then sans serif. And if I save it, there we go. And that looks pretty nice and clean. I really like the Roboto font. So that's how we can use basically non-web safe fonts. Okay, so next thing I want to look at is font size. Okay, so let's say font size. Now the standard is 16 pixels, and that's actually on the HTML tag. Okay, the HTML tag by default has a font size of 16 pixels. That's what you're seeing. That we do have this zoomed in a little bit. That's why it's bigger. Actually, let's put it back to just let's put it back to just 100%. So I'm going to do Control and then the minus, and that's 110. That's 100. So that's the default. So let's change it to 18 pixels. Okay, and for the most part, I usually leave it at 16, but just to show you, I'll change it to 18 and save, and now you can see it's bigger. Also, we can adjust the line height, which is basically the height of each line. So let's say line dash height, and this is usually in M units, which is a relative unit, and I'm going to go over rem and M units later on, so don't worry if you don't really understand this. But a common value I like to use for the line height for the body is 1.6 M. And we'll save, and notice how now there's more space in between each line. Okay, so I think it makes it look a little cleaner. Now I want to talk a little bit about units, so pixels, M, and so on. Now looking at this list of CSS units, this one which is absolute units, and then we also have relative units, it may be a little overwhelming, but don't worry about it because we don't use most of these. In fact, the only thing we're going to use on this page is pixels. Pixels is the common absolute unit that you're going to use. You can use centimeters, you can use millimeters, inches. You can set your font to 1 inch if you want, but that's not something that you're probably going to do. What you're going to use is pixels, and the exact size of 1 pixel is 1/96 of 1 inch. Okay, there's also points. Points may be familiar from something like Microsoft Word, and 1 point is 1/72 of 1 inch. You may run into points, but for the most part, you're going to see pixels. You also have picas, which it's actually equal to 12 points. Okay, you're not going to really see that. Now, there's also something called relative units, which I'm going to get into later. I'm not going to really focus on this right now. But for instance, you have percentage. You can set it to percentage of a parent element. And by the way, this doesn't have to be just font size. This could be for margin, padding, line height, what else? Width, height, all that stuff. Okay, so you also have M and rem units. M is basically it's a multiplier, so whatever the size of your parent element, let's say the parent div to a paragraph is 16 pixels, and you set it to 1M, that's going to be equal to 16 pixels. If you set it to 1.2M, that'll be equal to 16 pixels times 1.2. Rem units act the same way, except instead of the parent element, they use the root HTML element, which by default is 16 pixels. So if you set it to 1 rem, by default it'll be set to 16 pixels. And if this is confusing the crap out of you, don't worry, we're going to get into this stuff later. I'm not even going to bother going over viewport width and viewport height right now. Alright, so let's head back into VS Code. And I'm actually going to put the font family back to Arial, or Arial Helvetica Sans Serif. And I just want to show you a couple more font properties. So I want to look at font weight and font style, which are very simple. They're basically used to make some text bold or make text italic. So I'm going to add a span in here. So let's say span. I'm going to take the ending tag here, Control C, copy it, delete it, and then put that there, and also put a span down here. Oops. Let's do span, and we'll take the ending tag, put that down here. All right, so let's save that. Let's go up here, and I want to show you how to target these spans. So for this one here, we can say we want to go into the welcome div. Okay, so the div has the ID of welcome, and then we want to go into the paragraph, and then we want to go into that span. So that's how we can target this first span right here. Now technically we don't even need the paragraph, because it's still going to look into this div with the ID of welcome and then onto the span, but I think it's more organized to keep the paragraph in there, okay, just as an extra step. And let's say we want to make the font weight bold. And notice that this VS Code gives us the selections, which we could use numbers to make them more or less bold, but we're just going to choose bold and save, and notice how now the span, the text that's within the span, is bold. Okay, so just like the strong tag, we can set it to bold through CSS. So let's target this span down here by saying we want the about div paragraph span, and we're going to set the font style to italic and save, and now you can see it's very faint, but this text is now italic. So these are the font based properties. In the next video I want to start to get into colors, and you saw that I used, for instance, the color name like red and green. I also use this weird this number sign and then some letters. That's actually called hexadecimal. We also have something called RGB. So I want to look at colors and the different types that we can use in CSS.